Peace, Black family. So I just got finished watching the debut movie, American Maroon. Now, before I start my critique of this documentary, let me tell you what I'm not saying. I am not saying that foundational Black Americans do not have a claim to reparations. I am not saying that foundational Black Americans do not have the right to be their own ethnic group and self-identify. And for good measure, let me repeat the first one again. I am not saying that foundational Black Americans do not have a claim for reparations. I had to repeat that again for all the internet trolls looking for something to say. And lastly, I am not saying that this is not a good documentary and that these scholars did not bring the smoke. Now, what I am saying is there was a political, historical erasure of information. And I believe this erasure of information was done by none other than Tariq Nasheed. Now, I believe this erasure of history or omission of history in this documentary was done for political and economical reasons. As we all know, Tariq Nasheed sells FBA merchandise. And in my personal opinion, it's nothing wrong with that. He's selling his people cultural products that they resonate with. Here's where the problem lies. When you begin to omit other Black people's history because it doesn't align with your political agenda. Sadly, this is the same thing that we're complaining about and protesting against white people about. The fact that they erased our history by omission. Now, you're probably asking, what information that was omitted from the documentary that was so important? Well, for number one, the majority of the documentary and the information takes place in Florida. He talks a lot about the Seminole Wars and how Florida was a stronghold for African people. But somehow he left out Angola, Florida. Angola, Florida was a critical part of Florida history, and it also connects us to the African continent. You cannot talk about maroon colonies unless you talk about Angola, Florida. But something's telling me he did not want to make that connection, although I could be wrong. Secondly, how can you tell the story of Black people running to Florida to get away from slavery and not mention this man, George Biassou? But I also felt like he left out the story of George Biassou because George Biassou was from Haiti.
The Spanish government let the Maroons know if you went into Florida that you would be free. You can get your freedom if you went into Florida.
And with the Edict of 1693, the King of Spain basically says any African that absconds from the English plantations can come into La Florida and they can live in La Florida free.
At one point, so many foundational Black Americans were emancipating themselves in the Carolinas and running down into Florida. Officials had to make Georgia a state.
And one of the first people to make that possible was George Biassou, who was the second in command in the Spanish army. Why would he leave that information out of the documentary? As an African historian, I find that level of omission to be negligent. How do you not mention the thousands of Haitians who came to Florida with George Biassou? Not to mention, this man was very critical in training some of the first Seminoles. How do you not even add a portion about this great general who was a founding father of the Haitian Revolution and then came to Florida to run one of the biggest forts in Florida, allowing Black people to run and escape from slavery? How do you not have that in your documentary?
And George Biassou, he was the person that succeeded Boukman Daffy, and he will lead the troops for the first several years. There are other very important people also in these many armies, but he at one time had an army of 40,000 people that he's having to manage and supply and so on. So he was an important leader. Lo and behold, he ends up dying in St. Augustine at the end of all of this aftermath.
The nation's first Black general also lived in this home. As a Spanish general, he was the second highest paid official in Florida.
In conclusion, there should never be a monopoly on the storytelling of Black history. Because regardless of how you feel about me and my cultural background, I understand that history doesn't happen in a vacuum. But when someone is set on selling you a cultural identity through merchandise, they will surely have you believe that your history and your culture happens in a vacuum.